All right, hello and welcome. Today we're going to be doing a quick, I guess you'd say it's a study, but it's certainly going to be helping us to improve our landscape paintings. And the way I've got this set up, this is a reference image that I found from just a Google search. I really like the atmosphere of it. I like the atmospheric diffusion that we've got going on here. It creates a real sense of depth, and we're going to be breaking it down a little bit so that we can understand it and replicate it. So when we've got something that we want to create, like a unique mountain shape, for example, we can create that using similar thought processes to what we learned while we're doing this. The way I have my Photoshop set up here is I have two files open. Now, normally when you have two files open, they look like this, right? And then you can switch between them with the tabs. But if you go up here to Window and Arrange, you can go to 2 up vertical, and that allows you to, I wanted to put this one on the other side though, because I'm gonna be painting on the right, and I want the reference image to be on my left, so I set it up this way. And then also I've got the exact same proportions on the image over here on the right side, which is just a new canvas. I haven't even saved it yet. I should probably save it. The next thing I want to make sure that I talk about is the image size for the canvas. And this is really weird. Like I said, I just copied and pasted it from the internet, but you always want to do at least a minimum of 300 dots per inch. And then in terms of size, I think 8.5 by 12 or 13 is like, that's fine. You know what I mean? It's not going to be that important. Just make sure that you're always painting at a minimum of 300 DPI. I am going to zoom out. By the way, if you want to zoom out that way, you hold down the Z button and then you drag somewhat. But you have to have your Photoshop set up to do that. So you have to go to Photoshop and then Preferences, and then you'll probably have to go to Performance and then make sure that you have this ticked. Otherwise, that feature won't work, as well as the rotate feature, which I'm going to show you, as well as some other things. So just make sure that you have this Use Graphics Processor ticked, okay? You're going to need that to do things like this, and also, also it doesn't save that way. But also this, the zooming. Okay, so the first thing that I want to point out, and by the way, I'm just going to focus on this for a little bit to do some studying here. The first thing that you're going to notice is that this area up here kind of looks like the foreground. And the reason why it looks like the foreground to our eye is because it is the darkest area, the highest contrast, which is, if you look at, if I do a color select, all the colors as I move this around are in the same range. Look at where that is all along the bottom of this color picker, right? Now, when we go to the middle ground, you notice that they get a little bit lighter. It's a little bit higher on the value chart, right? Because this is all your lighter values. But look what happens when we go to the mid ground. That's like, you know, a couple, maybe a mile away, right? And let's look around in here. The darkest point back here, the darkest point doesn't go any more than, that's about 65 to 70%, maybe 70% dark in the value scale. And when we go even further back to these mountains back here, it gets not even to 50% at the darkest point, is like 50% gray, 50% dark. And when we go way back there, it does not even get to 20%. And this, even though it looks white, it's actually at about 15%. Now, we can use values. It's one really strong way to create a sense of depth, is to use values to separate your forms. And that's what we're going to be mostly focusing on for at least the first part, the sketch part of what we're going to be trying to achieve. Another thing that we want to analyze before we begin is that we want to figure out where is the horizon line. Now, normally, if you want to show a lot of a valley or something more at the bottom, you can move the horizon line up. If you want to show more of the sky, you can put that horizon line lower along the bottom. In this case, we're kind of doing a study, so we just want to identify where that horizon line is, which is right here. Now, I haven't yet decided. I think maybe I will do something that looks like a similar shape, but I'm not going to worry about getting it precise because I don't want you to worry about getting it precise. We're not going to be doing an exact replica of this image, although if you wanted to, you probably could, pretty easily. And Sure, a lot of you out there might be going, well, why don't I just photo bash? Well, you're not learning anything if you're just photo bashing it. It's very important when you're doing studies to dissect what you're doing and learn why it's working. So the next thing that I want to do is I want to create some masks, and I'm going to show you the simplest. There's a couple of different methods to creating masks, but I'm going to just do some. Oh, by the way, I've got this lasso tool selected, and we're just going to do some like super sketchy, twigs and trees, and I'm gonna even like go in and like add in some shapes of trees. All right, don't worry too much about getting like precise. We're not trying to go precise. In fact, it's all right if you want to go a little bit more stylized. Hey man, if you're following my art tutorials, you probably want to go a little bit more stylized. That's what I tend to lean towards myself. But if you want to go photorealistic for your studies, it's fine. You're not going to be posting these anywhere anyway. They're mostly just for you to learn, to absorb new information, new knowledge. So don't worry about it if it's not exact. Create a new layer by hitting Command-Shift-N, and then let's switch over to the airbrush and fill this in black. And now I am just going to use the airbrush tool, the airbrush brush, and fill that in black. Remember that we were looking at colors that were in this range for the absolute foreground area, right? And in fact, we're gonna just go ahead and name that FG for foreground. In fact, I'll call it foreground 1 for like the farthest foreground. And I got a little white spot that I missed right there, and I'm gonna tidy up just slightly, nothing too crazy. The next thing that I wanna do is make a selection for that middle ground area. And you're gonna wanna create a new layer for each plane. This is, I'm gonna call it MG1 because we're gonna actually have like, it looks like 2 or 3 middle grounds. So here, just to make sure that that reads as a little bit more of a mountain, I'm gonna kind of show the crest of it there. And then it's got like some fall off. And I'm just gonna fill the whole thing in with, if you recall, look at our values here. Let me switch back to this. Now look at our values when we're looking at this. The values for this one's still pretty dark, not as dark as what we see in the foreground, but we're just gonna fill that in. And by the way, we're doing all entirely gray as much as possible for all this. So let's do, just to make sure that it separates nicely, let's do about a 90% gray. Then what you're going to want to do is create a few different layers. You're going to want 2 midgrounds for this one, and then a background mountain range there. All of them separated onto their own layer so that we can move them around. You don't have to do it this way. This is just one way I'm doing it for purposes of explaining some composition things. Remember to refer back to what we were studying earlier. The value range should dictate how dark you go with each layer further back. And now it's good that we put these on different layers because we need to fix the composition. Let me explain. You've got this shape repeating a little too close to each other. And we want to make sure that we don't have too much of that because otherwise it looks man-made or manufactured. So by moving that around or creating perhaps a smaller mountain back there that is not too vertically aligned, because we also don't want to do this, by the way. We don't want it to be straight up from there. Like, then people might think that it's a shadow, and we want to really have a nice read on it. So having something that feels a little bit more jagged and less parallel, I think is going to really help to sell the mountain range. And right now we haven't really dug into to really do that just yet. And I think I want to move some things around. Let's do that. In fact, yeah, we could move this over to here, and be careful because you also want to make sure that you have, like, this is the same thing, and we call this a tangent when you get two objects where the edges are touching. And if you're wondering, well, why can't you do tangents? Well, because it disrupts the whole flow. And if you have one object that points into another object, then it disrupts the flow. It destroys the illusion of depth that we're trying to achieve. Having things like this, for instance, you see that would be a tangent where those 2 points are merging, and it confuses the viewer's eye as to what they're looking at. Have them like a full cross. You want it to cross over rather than it being something that is like touching and looks like maybe an extension of that line. You want to avoid that at all costs. Another nifty trick to manipulate these is if you hit Command T, you can warp. It's actually a transform tool. This allows you to skew or reshape a little bit, not to a huge degree, but enough to kind of skew it a little bit as much as we need, only because it's on its own layer, but it could be done with a selection as well. But something that works really well about this image is that you have a very prominent large mountain on that left side. So maybe I will just extend that all the way out like that. It's very prominent, and it avoids too many like tangents or anything like that. And then the final background that I want to do is just something that kind of looks like a sweeping valley or something back here. So we get a little bit, almost like a hint of a horizon line. Something way back there. And we're just going to go to like a 15% gray for that. Yeah, there we go. And then obviously our farthest background area here should have like just a little bit of gray to it. Oh, there we go. Not as dark as that one though, so that there's a sense of depth. So to paint these clouds, you could just go straight to like a cloud brush, but just to get things rolling, I'm gonna do like a soft transition with just a regular white brush. In fact, actually, we're not gonna do white. We're gonna do like a 20% gray. And you'll notice how that immediately separates these forms, right? Like, look at that dramatic difference. You can immediately see the separation of forms because we're also using value contrast. Value contrast creates depth between objects. And then if we go back to this one and we do one over here, we can also create a little bit of depth from the bottom of that mountain. So we really get this sense that there's like a under lighting that's happening. And I'm gonna define this even more with the airbrush, the cloud brush that I have in my resources pack, which you can download with this video. So the cloud here, and I'm gonna do it on another layer. These clouds, I mean, the cloud brush doesn't do all the work. You've gotta do a little bit. You still gotta like massage it. And watch those shapes and clustering, by the way, that I had been talking about before, to make sure that you get a very natural and organic looking flow to these clouds. And this is exactly the same thing that I was talking about before, where you don't want peaks to touch. You also don't want your clouds to like go up and touch the edges of these things, because then it distorts the shaping of it, and it's hard to see and read what it is that you're looking at. And so now that we've got a little bit more like cloud coming through here, we could even do one up like this that maybe implies that there's like a cloud going up onto that hillside. And I'm going to put some texture in on that in a minute, but for now, like, we're getting some nice progress here. I do like how this creates almost a sense of like there's maybe like separations in here. So I'm gonna make a selection, and I'm gonna use that cloud brush. And again, use size to create depth as well. So by doing smaller cloud shapes through here, we're also gonna help to define the sense of depth. And then deselect that, and then you can add some up through here too. So as you can see, we're starting to get some good shape definition there. This could be, by the way, on a layer in between these two, if you really wanted to do that. I'm just gonna call this the fog layer. Might as well. But it's also good to just keep these as pure selections, because what you can do is just select by holding down the command key and then selecting the thumbnail. It'll select the contents of that layer, essentially creating a mask. So if you have objects that are, for instance, a character's face or a tree, or if you have a structure in your environment and you think you might want to use that as a selection later, if that structure is just the only object on that layer and you select that thumbnail in your layer stack, it will select that whole house and then nothing else will be affected when you paint on it. And once that layer is selected, you can go in and like add textures, and which I'm not going to do just yet. Oh, you know what? I might as well just add like a layer of textured material. So I'm just going to do this all almost entirely in grayscale for now. And I'm using a textured brush here, probably not the best one. In fact, I am going to undo that, and I am going to, I really want it to be on another layer, actually. So I'm going to use that to select that layer, and then I've got a new layer for grass texture. And you don't have to layer, you don't have to name all of your layers like this, but it does help to keep things a little bit more organized. And I hope that you're drawing along with me, by the way. That's what these are designed for. Because you're going to get results out of this that you can carry with you. You can use this if you practice it, but if you don't, then you're not going to get much out of it. So like that's one way to add a little bit of texture to a selection that you already have, right? So now that I've explained why I do some of these objects in separate layers and how that could be beneficial to you, let's get back to finishing up some rendering on this fog, these kind of clouds in the mountains. So yeah, I want to keep like coming in here with some cloud, and notice that some of those clouds are like kind of stringy. I really like that. So I want to try to like a little bit of wispiness. It gives it a feeling of like a real fog layer coming through. I do notice that this background layer does get a little bit darker than what I have. So maybe you want to go in and you could darken it up a little bit if you wanted to. And then go in with the eraser tool or the airbrush, and you could soften where it connects to the mountain, for example, like right here, to separate those two forms. Because it is very foggy back there. And that's the whole point. We want to create a very foggy scene. And so we're just going to keep building on this because there's some really neat stuff going on here with these rock formations. And I think I want to just get a little bit more creative with it. I want to go off the rails a little bit. I hope that you'll come with me. And I think that you should feel free to do this exact thing in your painting too. When you start to kind of get it down, try to put in another mountain back there. Like, can you do that and still make it feel kind of separated? The point I'm trying to say here is that this is the part where you've begun to understand a part of how these forms are separating, so run with it. This is what I usually call it, like if you watched my previous Easy Art lessons, this is the playtime, man. This is the part where you get to take what you've learned and get creative and have fun with it, so try to put in your own mountain here. Now that we've got some of these things in place, we could go in and start texturing, but you know what? There's more jagged things going on here, like I really like these very organic looking kind of shapes that are happening. And also it's layered almost, things become almost flat when you have this much diffusion going on in your scene. And so like, let's try to get just a little bit of that in our hillside here. And just, you can go to that layer if you've got it and match it. And it's all right if it's got a little bit of that, notice how some of those back layers are just not as dark. And that creates a sense of a little bit more depth to it too. And like it's fading off into the fog. I want to go a little darker with it towards the top. There we go. We're going to add a little bit of texture to that later. Look at that pointy old mountain thing there. I don't think I want it to look that pointy, but you know what? There might be some like trees, and I could like imply a little bit more of something like that going on back there too. And by the way, that's another thing that I want to talk about. So we have these trees in the foreground that are not in our reference image, but we've got them in our shot. And so if you have a little tree back here, for instance, let's go to that layer that's This one is not, that's the grass texture, but this is your mid-ground one. Let's say that we have a few trees, or just some logs or twigs, some things popping up. If they look like trees from the same, like if we're seeing trees in the foreground here, and then we see similar trees back here, then we are going to, in our brain, the viewer will perceive a sense of depth. Because they're seeing this in the foreground. Let me get my red brush again so that I can make a note. They're seeing this in the foreground, and our subconscious brain makes the connection and goes, oh, that's the same tree. That's much further into the distance. So you could also have a human in the foreground. Like, I'm just going to doodle it in. I'm not trying to draw a human here when I do this. Just kind of like a stick figure, right? Let's say we got a guy with a backpack or something like that, and he's got the staff, the walking stick, right? The classic traveler with a walking stick, and he sees a guy back here, like something. It's almost, you wouldn't even really see that it's a human. But my point being that your brain immediately kind of goes, oh, well, that's a human scale, so, or that's the scale of the tree is defined in the foreground, and so like that tells us how far back that is to some extent as well. So, I think we could probably jump into texturing this a little bit with the grass texture. Let me find a good one here. Sometimes you just want to speckle it. And that's not bad either. So by selecting on that mid-ground and then going back to our grass texture, that allows us to get in there a little bit. And I believe we can go a little bit lighter, but don't go too light on that one. And I don't think the normal paint texture is enough. Or don't do just a spatter brush, by the way, is what I'm trying to say. And there are kind of like pockets where it's a little darker. So what you could do is grab just make it like 5% darker. And that can add to that. Now this is a lot easier because we have that mid-range mountain as a solid object that we can just, command click on the thumbnail and the layer stack, and we have a selection. Otherwise, we'd be painting all over. We wouldn't be able to use like noisy brushes or anything like that, or we'd have to erase out on that layer, for example. So it just saves us a bit of time to have that pre-saved selection. Yeah, and I'm not getting a very natural looking surface on this because I did it in like a really quick brush stroke, but I'm gonna go ahead and just like add in a little bit of darker material to that. So you can actually add to that mask if you go to the layer where you have your mid-range mountain. You can just add more detail to that. So feel free to experiment and explore a little bit of however you might like to do it as well. And then in the foreground, it seems like we're really not getting a lot of these shapes. We want to get some more of these natural looking limbs and tree trunks and things like that. So it's okay if you want to go in. I'm on that foreground layer right now, by the way, and just go in and add in some of the shapes that you're seeing in your reference to give it that natural. There's some twigs and like bent, bent branches and a little bit of just natural lines. Lines and leaves, and there's also these gaps between, you can really see between some of the branches and twigs. And again, we're not copying one-to-one. I don't want to just teach you to copy one-to-one. I think that that's fine if you're really struggling with it, but the idea is to capture the intention of it. The idea is to capture the shape of it, commit some of that to memory, and that way you can recreate it as long as you're paying attention to what it is that what you're studying. And yeah, this is where some of that stylization is just naturally going to come in, because that's my jam. That's what I like to do. And I think that's okay. In fact, if you want to go super stylized with this, I think you should feel totally free to do so. The point, more than anything, especially with studies, is to have fun doing it and to acquire some new thing that you hadn't done before. And my goal with these lessons is exactly that. I just want to hopefully unlock something that maybe you hadn't thought of before, so that you're doing it yourself. You're not just watching me do it in like a time-lapse thing and then trying to decipher it. It should be something that you're able to add to your own toolbox, your own toolkit. That's looking a lot more like a pine tree. And out of the corner of my eye, I keep glancing over at the shapes, and I might latch on to like one little part, like how this clump right here seems like it comes way out, and then it's got these tiny little clumps over there. So like I might do, a bigger clump here, and then like have another swooshing clump coming out here to emulate a little bit of what I'm seeing, so that I can get a little bit more of that kind of pine leaf structure in my silhouette as well. We're gonna Bob Ross this, by the way, dudes. We're gonna get in there with some like quick brush strokes later. This is just to really set the tone and define some of the more prominent shapes. And we also don't want to spend a ton of time, because it's just a study. This is not going to go in our portfolio. It's not going to be something that we show off to other people. It's just something that we use to understand a new technique and tool, or a new skill. We've added something to our repertoire, and then we're going to be able to replicate later. But when we're doing something creative, and right now this isn't creative, this is study. There's a big difference between the creative process and the study process. I think of it like you're teaching yourself a new language. You need to learn the words, but when you're trying to communicate, you call up on those words, those sentences, and the things that you've acquired during your studies, and you can call them up on a whim to communicate. That's exactly the same thing. Art is just a language. So think of it that way. It's just another language. You can say all the things. You can say more with art than you can with the language, actually. That's not to say that you shouldn't feel that you can be creative if you are painting along and you're like, oh, you know what though? I really want to put a castle on that mountain. Like, dude, I'm not going to stop you. I think that that's what you should be doing right now. But if you're overwhelmed with new information, just focus on grasping that first. Make sure we get some similar leaves to what we have over on the right side over here. And man, there's a lot of detail in this painting or in this original photograph when you look at it close, right? So what we could do is start to zoom in now if you wanted to, and actually start to shape those things out. The goal here is to analyze the details and the shapes of what it is that we're looking at from this reference image and emulate those in a value scale. If you need to, take your original that you're taking as a reference, that original mountainside on the left side, and just convert it to grayscale. You can hit Command U and turn it into a grayscale image, so that you can just analyze the values of how forms are separating. Watch out for those tangents. And I want you to create, and this is the homework, by the way, before you even move on, I would like for you to just grasp this concept from this one image that we've looked at. I highly recommend that you convert that image to grayscale and just pull value information. What I mean by that is the grayscale value. You want to create depth in your mountains. You want to create little trees and bushes, and continue to look back at that reference image and pull what you see from it, push that into your own piece. It doesn't have to be exactly where you see it in that other image. It doesn't have to be exactly 100% accurate, but if these trees look like they're pine trees, then make sure you get those little pine needles in there. And if you got little trees that you want to add a little bit more of an interesting tree line on that mountainside in the middle range, go in there and just start filling in some of those tree silhouettes. Now, this is the beauty of doing a piece like this, is it's really just about the composition. It's about communicating what forms we're looking at. Again, remember things like if you've got a tree in the foreground and it's a very clearly a pine tree, and you could have a similar pine tree in that middle ground and then even in the far background, but change the size so that it communicates the sense of scale and depth. And if you're in the foreground, then you could even get some of these little pine needles on these leaves to really communicate that what we're looking at is this very natural, organic pine needle type of a mountainside. I want you to spend as much time as you want on this to get it to looking good. And if you feel like it's not looking good yet, go back and redo that. When we are talking about drawing every day, a lot of times artists say, hey, just draw every day. This is the stuff that you draw every day. You do studies, you look at photographs, you look at existing things, you dissect them, you add them to your repertoire, you add them to your language so that you can recreate them on your own. I'm going off the rails at this point, and I want you to feel free to go off the rails. Be a little bit creative with it, as long as you feel like you're picking up something new. The biggest things that I picked up from this that I want you to pick up as well is that sense of depth, the layering of foreground, middle ground, and background, the fog coming in from underneath, the fog way off in the distance, that value range, and then also the sense of scale between the trees in the foreground, the trees in the middle ground, and the background. And of course, if you want to go absolutely nuts, start adding in things like a castle on that hillside or something like that, or add a moon in the sky. Maybe you could do a clearer sky and a more distinct horizon if you want to explore a little bit more. You could pull up a different image and do a same exact study where you're just convert it to grayscale and try to emulate what you're seeing, but with a little bit of your own flavor to it. And then even these little leaves back here, note that I'm adding depth by just lightening them. So then you've got this, foreground layer of the really dark, and then the middle ground layer just behind that where it's a little bit lighter. Anyway, so go ahead and spend as much time as you want on this one. I want you to feel great about it. Until you feel great about it, keep going back and doing more studies, okay? That means I want you to find a photograph from a landscape or a photograph book or something and do a study exactly as we've done. Just convert it to grayscale and then do an exact copy, or do something that's creative using the same sense of depth, and just pick up some details and implement them into your own piece. In the next lesson, we're going to create our own custom piece, something totally new, using everything that we just learned. That's an essential part of the learning process, so come on along.